back in the early to mid-19th century, a school of thought emerged known as phrenology. And what the phrenologists did was to try to examine people's skull shapes and to try to make some conclusions about what their personalities were like. Their argument was that there should be a relationship between brain structures in different parts of the brain and different psychological attributes. That, for example, if you had a lot of room up here, you must have some kind of trait like manipulativeness or openness to experience. And the idea was, if you look at the brain structures, if you look at how convex or concave you've got structures up here somewhere on the brain, in the on the skull, then you could make some kind of inferences about the brain. Let me just give you an example. Back in the back of the head, which we would now call the occipital lobes, they noticed that in mountaineers and in housewives there seemed to be a particular elevation. And the idea was that they decided that this probably had something to do with territoriality and sticking to one's, guarding one's turf. Now, there was a lot of observation that went into phrenology. These people took a lot of time examining thousands of heads to come up with this, to document this theory and to come up with some kind of empirical details and to really try to flesh out which parts of the brain were controlling which trait. There was one problem with this theory, despite the fact that it used some very interesting methods and was based on a very interesting idea, a piece of which is true, namely that different parts of the brain do tend to control different functions, though not quite the way the phrenologists believed. The main problem with this theory was that it was entirely spurious. There's no connection whatsoever between bumps on the head and the underlying brain structures, unless, of course, you've gotten into some kind of accident and you've had your skull smashed, and then there is a connection. Beyond that, there is no connection in normal people whatsoever. Now, this kind of theory in technical terms, where is your blackboard when you need it? In technical terms, this kind of theory is known as crappy. There are many such theories in the social sciences. There have certainly been many in psychology. And they're not all limited to the 19th century. I would have begun with one from the 20th century, even from a contemporary theory, but I never know who's going to be doing these videotapes after me, so I had better stick with people who are dead. The question you may raise then is, if a theory can take us this far astray, if a theory can be this wrong, why don't we simply do without theories entirely? Why don't we simply stick to the facts? The reason that we don't is that we can't. We are cognitively or psychologically, we are unable to see things and to understand things without imposing some kind of order on it ourselves. We are never just seeing facts out there. We are always somehow imposing order on the data that we see. Now, this is true not only of scientific theories, which I'll be talking about soon, but it's true even of minor perceptual experiences. If you look at the handout for today, what does that look like to you? Looks like silhouettes. Anyone see anything else? A vase. If you look at it one way, can everybody see the silhouettes of faces? Can everybody see the vase? Does anybody see them both at the same time? There are medications for that. You really shouldn't be. You really shouldn't be able to see both of those at the same time. If you see them as a vase face, then you're probably in serious trouble. What that is an example of, it's an example that the Gestalt psychologists came up with many years ago around the turn of the century. Gestalt psychologists argued, they were perceptual psychologists, they were interested in the way we perceive. And they argued that we don't just see little isolated bits of information, but we in fact always form information into some kind of coherent unit. In this case, we look at this thing and we turn it into something. We make it something in our minds, and whether you see it as one thing or another, it will depend on a number of things, but each individual part that you look at now will be viewed through the lens that you've just, or through the interpretation that you've just made. For example, if you look at the middle part of that picture, what do you see? Take an isolated detail there. Okay, you see noses. Now, are those noses, or are they an indentation on the vase? Which one are they? Okay, clearly they're noses. We have this established now. Okay, these could be noses, or they could be indentations on the face. The point is that which they are really depends on the theory that you come up with of the whole. If your theory is that this is a couple of faces and silhouettes, then what you are seeing noses. If your theory is that it is a vase, then you're seeing something entirely different. You're seeing indentations in the same spot. Now, if this is true of something perceptual like this that you're seeing up close, you can bet it's true of broader aspects of perception and even of more complicated scientific theories. Let's take one more perceptual example. You're walking down the street, and you see several hundred miles away, you start to make out a human form. And you say, is this what you do? You look at it and you say, I see a nose. Yes, eyes, there are eyes. Aha, there are ears, a neck, it's a person. You don't do it that way. Instead, what happens is you see a percept. You see that this is a person out there in the first place. And then you start to see everything beginning to fit in. And if, in fact, you don't see the nose or the eyes, you start to find yourself rather distressed. The point is that we are seeing things as organized wholes. This indeed appears to be true of science as well. The argument has been made by a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn that scientific theories don't develop by isolated bits of information building up one after another, but in fact we are always piecing together some broad theoretical framework to help ourselves understand the reality that we're trying to understand. By the way, I speak relatively quickly, as some of you perceptive people might have noticed. If I get too fast, an appropriate hand signal might help. Okay, I'm not sure it will always work, but I'll give it my best shot. What Kuhn argued is that science develops not through the progressive development of more and more facts, but rather through the development of what he called paradigms. What he means by paradigms are broad ways of seeing things in a discipline. For example, in physics, Newtonian physics was a paradigm. In economics, classical economics was a paradigm. Basically, it was a set of ideas, of theoretical propositions, of assumptions, of methodological prescriptions of how you should go about studying this area. What Kuhn argues is that the way science progresses is something like this. Once a scientific community has emerged and people basically are in agreement on some kind of paradigm, they basically agree this is how things are in this area of reality. Say we're economists, we believe basically that the laws of supply and demand are going to, that explains economic processes. Okay, so we have a group of people who are all deluded together. He calls this the period of normal science, and what normal science means is it's essentially business as usual. Everything is proceeding as it should. Then what happens is a number of anomalies start to show up, things that don't fit with the paradigm. And suddenly scientists have to try to figure out, well, how do we fix up these anomalies? How do we make them fit back into our paradigm? And how do we understand them from the perspective of our current theories and our current paradigm? Normally, these are handled with sort of problem solving. Little experiments are done, little papers are written, and essentially people will solve problems as they go along as these anomalies arise. But a point emerges, according to Kuhn, at which point what happens is that the scientists no longer can explain those anomalies within the paradigm. Too many of them are starting to emerge, or some major anomalies emerging that cannot be explained easily using this paradigm anymore. And so what he argues happens is you now see a period of what he calls revolutionary science, where now scientists are starting to look for an alternative paradigm. And actually the metaphor he uses by calling it revolutionary science is he's using the metaphor of a revolution that occurs in a society where suddenly the old order is going to be thrown off and a new order is going to take hold instead. What happens in a period of revolutionary science then is people begin looking for some kind of new paradigm. Eventually they find one. Eventually that starts to explain things better than the old paradigm did. And what you then find is that the scientists now move into that paradigm as their basic paradigm. A new period of normal science emerges now where everybody accepts this paradigm. Now paradigm change occurs not only when when the old scientists become converted to a new paradigm. And when I say converted, he really had in mind something akin to religious conversion, that it's not just a matter of, well, these facts really lead us to believe this. But once you have a paradigm that you're starting to believe in, there's a matter of belief. You're saying, I think it is like this. Just like in that picture, you say, this looks like a couple of faces in silhouette. Therefore, I believe that is a nose. And you essentially make some kind of leap of faith, and you say, I believe that, for example, supply-side economics is going to explain how we're going to get out of this next recession. As soon as you have that belief, you start interpreting everything in line with supply-side economics. What happens, as well as the other way that paradigms change, he and others have noted, is that the old scientists who are committed to the old paradigms die off, but that's another matter. So his argument then is that science is not so much, if you were to think in terms of metaphors of how science proceeds, it's not just a matter of we test a hypothesis, we get a good study, it shows this for sure is true, and we sort of lay that first empirical brick. And then we do another hypothesis, we test it, we find it's true, we lay the next empirical brick, and we build the house of science brick by brick by brick. His argument instead, I guess you could say, if we're thinking in terms of metaphors, is that rather science is more like weaving tapestries, and that the thread that we use to weave those tapestries is thread from our own thought. It is the way that we are weaving it together ourselves, and there is no way to do without that thread, even though that thread is not part of the reality out there. That thread is something that comes from our mind, but we are simply incapable of understanding reality without those threads. Let me now use an example from psychology, because the topic of this lecture series is normality and abnormality, and the question of how do we understand normal personality as well as problems that people have in their lives. Let me take an example, a clinical example. I am a clinical psychologist, incidentally, as well as a researcher and teacher, which means that I see patients. I have a private practice. The case is this. Suppose a person comes into a psychologist's office and says, "Doctor, I have this irrational fear of getting into the car and driving." Not a terribly uncommon phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear. So the person has a phobia or irrational fear of driving. And suppose he goes to a psychologist with one theoretical perspective, which we'll be talking about next time in the next lecture, and that is psychoanalysis. He comes in, and the psychoanalyst is going to be interested in broader aspects of this person's functioning than just is he afraid of cars? Is he afraid of other things? What kind of experiences has he had as a child? What kind of experiences has he had in his lifetime? How does he think and feel? And this psychologist might, for example, start to explore, well, what's on your mind when you start to think about, when you think about cars, what comes to your mind? And gradually he may find, for example, this person starts to think back and think in his mind about what comes to his mind, and he says, well, you know, I'm thinking about a time last year when I was driving along, and I was really angry because these pedestrians kept walking in my way. I just had this impulse to hit one of them. And I stopped myself, but I really had this impulse to hit one of them. Now, the psychoanalyst or psychoanalytic psychologist at this point might start thinking that what's happening here is that this person probably has a fear of his own aggression. He's got some aggressive impulses that are getting expressed while driving that are probably getting expressed elsewhere. And what's going to happen is he is now essentially afraid of driving and afraid of getting in the car, but that's not his real fear. His real fear may be that he's got these aggressive impulses that he can't handle. And in fact, in the clinical case that I'm thinking of, this was indeed a person who had a number of issues around, a person who did come in with this kind of autophobia, had a number of issues around aggression that were showing up in all kinds of places in his life. So the first psychologist says, okay, the problem here is the way thoughts and feelings are connected up in this person's head. Thoughts, feelings, and impulses, and the way the person is dealing with his impulses. Okay, suppose the person goes for a second opinion. Goes to a second psychologist who we'll see is a behaviorist. And he tells the psychologist, I've got this problem, I have trouble getting into cars, I have trouble driving because I get scared. Now this psychologist, rather than looking at the childhood antecedents of this or this person's impulses and aggression, might instead see something like this. The problem here is that you've got a connection between a stimulus, something in the environment, a car, and some kind of emotional response, in this case anxiety. That in turn is connected with avoidance behavior. This person is now avoiding doing something that he should be able to do. So what is the solution? The solution is that you need to break that connection. What you need to do is to get this person no longer to be afraid of cars. You need to be able to break the connection between the stimulus and the response. And that's what you're going to have to do. So whereas the first psychologist is saying essentially, what you need to do for this person is to help him deal with his aggressive impulses. The second psychologist is saying, that's not the issue at all. What you need to do is to come up with a program whereby, for example, you make this person sit in a car and drive a car enough times that he's no longer anxious and that he's no longer avoiding it. Okay, so that's the second psychologist. Now this person gets a third opinion. Goes instead to a psychiatrist who let's in this case take a biologically oriented psychiatrist, one who typically will prescribe medications. Patient comes in, says the same complaint, gives him the same complaint, and the psychiatrist says, well, the problem here is you have an anxiety disorder, and what that means is that you get anxious in situations in which you shouldn't, and your anxiety is really out of line. What you need is a medication that can block the action of the neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals in your brain which are transmitting information from one neuron to the next, or from one nerve cell to the next. You need some kind of anti-anxiety medication that will block that connection, and therefore you won't feel anxious anymore. So now you have it. This guy has gone to 3 different professionals, gotten 3 entirely different perspectives. One sees a problematic dealing with impulses. A second sees a problematic connection between a stimulus and an emotional response and a behavior. The third sees a job of bad wiring in the brain. Now, I might add that if he went to a psychologist with no perspective whatsoever, what he would probably be told, the psychologist would probably be entirely befuddled and recommend that he ride a bike. So, the point of all that is that in the field of psychology, like in every other field, and you certainly see it when you're dealing with clinical phenomena, is there is no way to see things without a perspective. And the question is, how can we make it, how do you compare across perspectives? How can you make the perspectives that we have work? How can we make them work better? And how can we use them to understand normal and abnormal functioning? So I guess I'll conclude this first section by suggesting that the development of scientific understanding, and this is certainly true in psychology as well, is more like a progressive process of grinding and regrinding theoretical lenses. It's not just a matter of seeing facts out there and adding them all up and sticking them in the textbook and there we have knowledge. It's much more like a matter of creating lenses for ourselves that we collectively can use to improve our vision. The problem is that these lenses are always going to be sometimes too convex, sometimes too concave, sometimes simply scratched, and at other times the lens that we use coming from one particular perspective may make us blind to something that seems right in front of our noses from another perspective. So those lenses can in fact not only lead us to be able to see clearly, but they can also be blinders. The problem, however, is that without them we are totally blind. And that's why what I'll be focusing on for this series of lectures is perspectives in psychology, particularly perspectives that can help us understand personality. And by personality I mean not just what we think of as personality in the popular media, for example, how a person acts and how they're seen. That is an important part of personality, but psychologists following one psychologist named Gordon Allport have typically said that personality includes not only the way we behave and our reputation to others based on how we behave, but also the internal psychological processes that lead us to behave that way. So essentially all of the workings of our mind that lead us to think and feel and behave in particular ways are part of our personality. But we'll also be talking about how these perspectives can help us understand when personality goes awry, when there are problems in living that a person has that come from that person's personality in some way. And that's what we'll be talking about. We're going to focus in the next 7 lectures on 2 perspectives in particular. We're going to focus on these because they are the 2 most comprehensive theories of personality that we have that can be used to explain normal as well as abnormal functioning. And those are psychoanalytic approaches and cognitive behavioral approaches, sometimes called cognitive social or social cognitive approaches. What I'd like to do today, though, is to say something about a very different kind of approach that, though not quite as comprehensive yet as a theory of personality, there certainly isn't a thoroughgoing biological theory of personality. The understanding of personality and abnormal psychology from biological perspective is important enough that I'd like to spend the rest of today's lecture dealing with that. It is very easy to see ourselves as psychological creatures without any biology, in the sense of it's easy not to see ourselves, or our personalities, or who we are as derived in some way from the interaction of neurons in our nervous system. I mean, it's very difficult to see yourself as a collection of neurons that are interacting in particular ways, and why am I sociable? Well, I got these neurons that are doing this and that. Why am I pretty anxious? Well, it's because I've got these neurotransmitters that are a little too active. Why am I a happy person? Well, I've got these dopamine neurotransmitters they work pretty well in my case. I mean, that's not how we typically think of ourselves. That all seems to change when you start to look at cases in which the nervous system is affected in some way or compromised in some way by stroke or by injury or by disease. A famous case, to give an example, was of a man named Phineas Gage, who was injured in a construction accident back in the 19th century. Back, I believe, in 1848. Gage had a metal rod ended up going right through his skull around the area of the frontal lobes. It really went straight through. Now, Gage afterwards behaved very strangely. He did survive that, remarkably, but he had some changes in his personality. For example, he became very lewd. His comments were inappropriate. He had trouble seeing other people's perspective. He had trouble maintaining his attention on things. He would often tell childish jokes and seem to act impulsively. Now, those are all symptoms of disturbances in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are involved in a number of different functions in the brain. They include things like ability to focus your attention, ability to take other people's perspective, social appropriateness, and the ability to follow social norms and have a sense of conscience, etc. So it was not a surprise that, given the extensive damage in the frontal lobes for him, that you would see those kind of difficulties. But the question then you raise is this him? When he tells an inappropriate joke, do you say, this is Phineas Gage telling an inappropriate joke? Or is this a defective brain telling an inappropriate joke? Similarly, many of you may have had this experience with aging relatives who have a stroke, for example, and suddenly they are acting very different, or a relative who has any kind of degenerative brain disease like Alzheimer's disease, and they begin to behave very differently. Do you blame them for it? Do you get upset about them for it? Do you say, well, this is my aunt or this isn't my aunt? Who is it speaking? The problem for us is that the heart of our, what we typically think of as our personality, or the theologically minded would think of as our soul, is based in our brain. Who we are is so based in our brain and the rest of our nervous system that it's very difficult to disentangle that from our personality and from who we are. Now, some very seemingly psychological things can in fact have neural origins in terms of damage of one sort or another. Let me give you an example. A patient who has bipolar disorder or otherwise known as manic depression, who may have periods of extreme grandiosity where, say, he believes that he is a messenger of God here to do some particular duty, or may even believe that he is God. Now, that seems like a very psychological thing. I mean, how would you think that the misfiring of neurons could lead a person to have a particular set of cognitions or thoughts, like believing that he is a messenger of God? Yet, indeed, that is the case. Delusions about the action of the CIA in schizophrenics, in paranoid schizophrenics. Again, very specific content to that delusion, yet you are again looking at the abnormal functioning of the brain. There's a kind of hyper-religiosity that you see in some small percentage of typically poorly treated epileptics. I don't mean poorly treated. I don't mean badly treated by doctors. I mean treated and the treatments are not working very well. That you sometimes see particular kinds of epilepsy. A really very sad case was of a Texas mass murderer many years ago. You may remember him. Was a bell tower murderer who was a young man who murdered many people, and eventually, I believe, took the gun to himself and killed himself at the end. The sad thing about that case, aside from the fact that so many people were murdered, was that this was a young man who, when he was writing letters to his parents around this time, and he was describing not feeling like himself. He was having these rage attacks. He was describing feeling that he was having these terrible headaches. It turned out that he had a tumor in a section of his brain that's involved in motivation, particularly with aggression and with emotion. And this guy ended up killing a number of people, presumably, as best we can tell, because of that tumor. Do you blame this man? Do you say because this abnormal mass emerged in his brain that therefore he's somehow responsible? You can see that some very salient issues of responsibility are going to emerge from this. Let me now say something about how these biological approaches can tell us something about, not in the abnormal range, I'll get back to that in a second, but within the normal range. There is a great deal of evidence now emerging that suggests that differences between individuals may have, some of those differences may have bases in our temperament, or that is in essentially biological differences in aspects of our personality. It used to be believed by psychologists that environment really explained all of our personalities. That's something that parents typically believe in until they have their second child. And they realize that second child comes out very different than that first child, and from the very start may have a different kind of activity level, may be a crier, may not be a crier, may be more sociable, may be less sociable, and that doesn't appear reducible very easily to changes in the way the parent is dealing with that child. You are dealing with a different organism. In many of the best studies that have come out on trying to look at biological bases of personality and of individual differences in personality, have compared monozygotic twins, that is, identical twins, with dizygotic twins, that is, twins who came out at the same time. They were in the uterus at the same time, but they essentially are different in their biological makeup. Genetically, they are no more related than normal brothers and sisters. That is, their degree of relatedness is half. Now, in one study comparing dizygotic and monozygotic twins, Arnold Buss and his colleagues found evidence for heritability of 4 traits in particular. One of them is emotionality. That is the extent to which a child is likely to be fairly emotional or fairly unemotional. A second is activity level, and that is how active this child is from the start and later becomes. A third is sociability. How much does this child or later this adult seek relationships with people? And the fourth was impulsivity, or the speed of their response. How quickly do they respond to things? Now, there have been some fascinating studies of adults that have been done recently coming out of Minnesota, University of Minnesota, by Bouchard and Tellegen and their colleagues, looking at twins who were separated at birth or shortly thereafter. So what they've got is they've got dizygotic twins, they've got monozygotic twins, but they also have twins who are reared apart from each other, as well as twins who are reared together, which is what many people have looked at before. There are some remarkable cases that you will read coming out of these studies. I mean, some of them sound like something out of the Twilight Zone. I'll give you an example of one of those. There was a case of 2 brothers, one of whom had been raised in Germany, and in fact was raised as a Nazi, and the other was raised as a Jew and lived for a while on a kibbutz. Now, they met as adults, and they had many similar idiosyncrasies, which was the remarkable thing about it. For example, they were both very absent-minded. They both tended to read magazines from the back to the front, which may make sense in the Israeli, but does make a lot of sense in the Nazi. They also had a habit of wrapping rubber bands around their wrists, and there are a number of stories like this of people who had the same kind of peculiar obsessional rituals where, for example, they'd walk into the water up to their knees, but then they'd get anxious and they'd stop walking any further. Those were the kind of examples that, you certainly, or there was another case in which of two women and their who had been reared apart, who were twins, and one of them named her child Andrew Richard, and the other named the child Richard Andrew, or something like that. Now, that one's pretty hard to explain biologically. That just sounds kind of fluky. I mean, hard to imagine that there's a center in the brain that controls naming of children. But in terms of the research that has been done by the Minnesota researchers, not only did they found something in a large sample of their subjects that's very similar to what they found in these two people. Not only did they have similar idiosyncrasies, but they also, when you gave them an MMPI, which is one of the major psychological tests that tries to get at aspects of personality and abnormal functioning, these people looked very, very similar, even though they'd had about as disparate environments as you could ask. Well, let me give you an example of some of the numbers on this. What they did was they ran correlation coefficients, or did correlations between these twin scores on, say, a variable like, let's take the case of, sense of well-being. Your just general psychological sense of well-being. What a correlation does is it looks at if one of the twins is high, is the other twin high? If one of the twins is low, is the other twin likely to be low? Correlations run from -1 to 1. A 1.0 correlation means it's a perfect correlation. If, for example, you had a correlation between parents and children's IQ of 1.0, that would mean if your parents' IQs are 130, then yours is going to be 130. Correlation of -1 means that it's the opposite direction, that if you're high on some variable, then you know and someone is highly correlated with you, you'll know that they'll be very low on that same variable. So those are or on whatever variable you're looking at. So those are examples of how correlations work. And a correlation of 0 means there's no connection at all, that you're essentially, one does not predict the other. Correlations tend to run in the direction of, if you want a strong correlation, a very strong correlation is about a 0.5 or so. If you've got a 0.5 correlation, you know there is a very, very strong relationship between these two variables. Personality researchers typically find correlations around 0.3, which is a decent enough size. So that gives you some background for listening to these correlations. On the sense of well-being, Telgen and their colleagues found that for monozygotic twins who are reared apart, these are twins who are identical twins genetically but are reared apart, their sense of well-being correlates at 0.48, which is a phenomenally high correlation. For dizygotic twins reared apart, that is, these people share half of their genes, but they're also reared apart, the correlation is 0.18. For monozygotic twins who are reared together, the correlation is 0.58, so that is indeed higher than the 0.48. Statistically, whether it's significant, I don't know. Dizygotic twins who are reared together, the correlation is about 0.23. What you are seeing is a very significant biological effect, that these are people who have never met each other before, yet their sense of well-being is correlated at around 0.5, which is really quite remarkable. Another example, negative emotionality is another variable that they looked at. Monozygotic twins reared apart had a correlation of 0.61 on how much negative emotion they experience in their lives by self-report. And these are people who, again, were reared apart. They did not have shared environments. Dizygotic twins who were reared apart had a correlation of 0.29, which is also relatively high, but again, you can see there's a very big difference between the monozygotic and the dizygotic. So what this is suggesting is that indeed, from a biological perspective, our personalities are certainly shaped in part by biological or temperamental factors, even though that's something, it's a way of thinking that we typically haven't thought very much about in this culture. And in part, I think that's because of broader cultural values and ideals and beliefs, that we have a lot of ideas, the idea that people are essentially created equal is something that's very important to us, and people have not wanted to think about biological differences between people. We like to say that there are no differences between people, that essentially at birth everyone is a blank slate, as John Locke told us. But from a biological perspective, that really doesn't appear to be true. That we start out with different talents and different vulnerabilities. In terms of pathology, or that is sickness of the mind, or psychopathology, there are also, the biological perspective is particularly important. Let me give you a couple of examples. The best example is probably schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a very, very severe mental disorder in which the person loses contact with reality, in the sense that the person may have hallucinations and not be able to tell what's in my mind versus what's out there. The person may have delusions and believe that all kinds of things are happening that really aren't happening. May have a delusion about the CIA. May have a delusion that people are coming after him or coming after her. Those would be examples of schizophrenic symptoms. Schizophrenics typically have peculiar emotion or affect, and that is that they will often laugh inappropriately, or they will have a kind of a flat, what's described as flat affect or flat emotion, where they don't seem to respond at all emotionally in situations that most people would experience emotion. Now, about 1 to 3% of the United States population has schizophrenia, which incidentally is quite similar to other cultures. There is strong evidence for the genetics of schizophrenia. Monozygotic twins reared apart have a concordance rate of 77.6%. That is, if you have never met your schizophrenic twin and you are identical twins, you have identical genes, you essentially have 76% of the time, if your brother or sister is schizophrenic, so will you be. I might add, though, that you can see the environmental effect as well, because monozygotic twins reared together have a concordance rate of 91.5%, which is about as high as you can possibly get. That obviously shows some environmental impact, but it also suggests that the lion's share is indeed genetic. Identical twins are over 3 times as likely to be concordant and 35 to 60 times more likely than members of the general population to be concordant for schizophrenia. So here's a case in which we clearly know that there is a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia, and it is plays a very significant role in the development of schizophrenia. We don't know, for example, if it's possible to develop schizophrenia without that biological vulnerability. It's simply something that we don't know. I might add that is not to say that environmental factors don't make a difference. One of the things that a number of studies have emerged that suggest that the amount of negative expressed emotion in a family of a schizophrenic, however much essentially negative emotions expressed in that house, how much tension and hostility are openly expressed, predicts remission rates in schizophrenics. That is, if the schizophrenic is treated and gets better, if there's a lot of this kind of intense negative emotion expressed in the household, you are more likely to see that schizophrenic individual having a relapse. So we do know, in fact, that there are environmental contributions to it, yet again, I think the lion's share of this really is biological. Now, how would something like this happen? How could you have a biological basis for something like a delusion or like having hallucinations? There are a number of competing hypotheses in schizophrenia. I'll mention one of them because it's the one for which we have the best evidence, and that's the dopamine hypothesis. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of those chemicals that's used to transmit information from one nerve cell or neuron to the next. And what happens is, between neurons, what you have is a basic gap that's called a synapse, or a synaptic cleft, where the two neurons connect. And the way neurons pass information along is that they send, when this neuron, we'll call it neuron A, when neuron A fires, it sends neurotransmitter into that synaptic cleft, or into that synapse, or into that gap. The second neuron then picks up that transmitter in some receptors along its membrane. So it receives that information, and that will lead it to be more likely to fire and send on information onto the next neuron. So what we've got is this neuron to neuron connection. Now, dopamine is a particular kind of neurotransmitter. There are many, and we've been discovering more and more over the last 20 years. But dopamine is one that appears to be implicated in schizophrenia for a number of reasons. And the suggestion is that schizophrenics have essentially too much or overactive dopamine release. There's too much dopamine active in their systems. Main reasons we have to believe this. One is that amphetamines cause increased activity at dopamine receptors. That if you give someone amphetamines, there's going to be more dopamine activity. In normal individuals, if you give them too much amphetamine, you can produce an amphetamine psychosis. You can create schizophrenic-like symptoms. So that is one reason. And in fact, if you give amphetamines to schizophrenics, you can precipitate a schizophrenic break, or you can make their symptoms worse. So that is one reason we have to believe that dopamine is indeed involved. A second is that drugs that block dopamine can cause a decrease in schizophrenic symptoms. That is, if you have a drug that comes in and, for example, remember I was talking about how you send out neurotransmitters into the synapse, and then it's picked up by receptors. If you send in a drug that blocks those receptors so they cannot pick up any more dopamine, you will find that you're likely to have a decrease in schizophrenic symptoms. So essentially what that's suggesting is you block the dopamine and there are less of the symptoms. So those are some reasons we have to believe that dopamine does appear to be implicated. Though I might add that's a very oversimplified hypothesis, because all of these different neurotransmitters interact with each other in very, very complex ways. So it probably isn't just one neurotransmitter system. It's probably many. Let me give you one more example of another kind of psychotic disturbance. That is another disturbance in which the sense of reality is grossly disrupted. The ability to tell what's in your head from what's not in your head is grossly disrupted. And that's bipolar disorder, otherwise known as manic depression. Again, the genetic evidence is very, very clear. The concordance rate for monozygotic twins for schizophrenia, that is, if you are identical twins, the concordance rate is 67%. If you are fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, the concordance rate is about 20%. This is from a study of 110 twin pairs. 80 to 90% of people who have bipolar disorder have a family history of some kind of mood disorder. So again, what we're speaking about is a situation in which it is very, very clear that there's a genetic basis to this disorder as well. Again, we don't know about biological contributions. When you see that there's a 67% concordance rate for bipolar disorder among identical twins, that means that there's a 33% non-concordance rate. How do you understand that? How is it, if this is indeed genetic, are we seeing a situation in which the gene is always expressing itself or sometimes expressing itself, or some kind of life experiences can cause that vulnerability to essentially get expressed, that something can cause that person then to snap? We really don't know. That's really knowledge that is well ahead of where we are now. Some forms of severe depression appear to have substantial biological components. As well may some forms of less severe depression, though again, these are things that we don't know a great deal about. In a moment, I'll say something about a lot of ideology that's involved in this, and that is a lot of ideas and commitments, philosophical as well as scientific commitments, as well as, I might add, financial commitments that are involved in why people believe what they do as far as these different perspectives are concerned. The way you then treat, if indeed we take a biological perspective on mental disorder like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or in the case with which we began, of the man with the auto accident, of the autophobia, who is essentially afraid of getting in cars. Suppose you say, well, that's an anxiety disorder and that's a problem. How would you treat this from a biological perspective? What you would do, essentially, is you would treat it with medications that are aimed at somehow affecting how much neurotransmitter there is in the system, how it's picked up, etc. Let me give you a couple of examples. If we know, for example, that in schizophrenia there is too much dopamine, then what we do is to try to give a drug that blocks dopamine. It blocks those receptors, essentially locks them up so they cannot receive that dopamine. If, on the other hand, in a case with severe depression, for example, particularly a person who comes in and describes not only feeling terribly down, may have delusions about having done some terrible thing that has ruined everybody around, or the person may have believed that he or she is rotting inside, or really we're talking about a very, very severe depression, often comes along with either a kind of agitation where the person is really on edge, or may come along with tremendous slowing, called psychomotor slowing, where the person speaks, you can tell I don't have this, speaks very slowly, or on the other hand, the person may walk very slowly. The person will often describe anhedonia, that is, nothing feels pleasurable at all. The person may describe things tasting different. Everything tastes like cardboard, you'll sometimes hear the person say. When you see a depression like that, you start to think about possible biological bases for it. Some evidence suggests that in some patients who are depressed, you see too little activity of other neurotransmitters. So whereas too much dopamine seemed to be involved in schizophrenia, in some cases of depression, you may see too little of neurotransmitters like serotonin, for example, or noradrenaline, or norepinephrine is the other name for it. These are things that are often involved in energizing people as well as other functions. So if you see too little, there are a number of things that you can do. One of them is you can try to give the person a drug that will somehow stimulate the production of that neurotransmitter, or that will, or another way is to use a drug that will keep it in the synapse longer. For example, you can use a drug for depression that normally what happens is when the neurotransmitter is sent into the synapse, it's then, once it's made its connection, there's some feedback mechanisms that essentially bring it back into the first neuron, and then it's called reuptake. They essentially take it back in, and then they hold it for a while until it's ready to fire again. If you administer a drug that breaks down this capacity to keep holding it, essentially it breaks down the materials that are involved in, well, actually, I guess it's more accurate to say what it does is to break down the chemicals that are involved in taking that neurotransmitter back up and breaking it down so that it's no longer active. If you can instead make it stay in the system longer, you can keep serotonin or you can keep noradrenaline in the system. So essentially what's happening with some of these drugs is you can block it coming back into the being taken back up again, blocking reuptake. You can block it being broken down in the first place so that it will essentially stay in the system longer. So those are the ways that you would try to treat these things biologically. Now, when I said before that there's a lot of ideology involved in this, there are many advantages to thinking about psychological disorders biologically. One of them is that in cases like schizophrenia and cases like depression, particularly severe depressions and particularly bipolar depression, when the person has both the manic pole and the severely depressed pole, it seems to me crystal clear that a disease model is absolutely applicable. That when you say you can look at the brain can get a disease just like the liver can get a disease, just like the heart can get a disease. You can have vulnerabilities the same way. You can say, you can have a vulnerability to a weak heart, just as you can have a vulnerability to a weak brain. Now, the thing that makes this much more troubling and makes it much more difficult is the brain is the seat of us. You can't say, well, I got a bad heart, I'm taking my pills for it. I mean, instead, now you're talking about, I got a bad me. I mean, because you think of, you are, it's my brain, it's my soul, it's my character, it's my personality. And those are the times at which it becomes extremely difficult to think this way. Yet at the same time, clearly, you can have a disease of the brain like you can have a disease of anything else. So I think there are clearly advantages from that sense for thinking biologically. There are some other advantages, however, which are problematic, that have led for a swing in psychiatry now, in which what you find are a number of people who should probably be treated psychologically or being treated medically. I mean, the classic example is that the patient comes in to the psychiatrist and says, I'm feeling a little depressed these days, and within 10 minutes has a subscription for antidepressants. A prescription for antidepressants. Now, at times that may be very appropriate, but you will also, as a clinician, hear horror stories of people who, for example, I can think of from both my private practice and from supervising at a clinic. I can tell you of many cases where someone has come in who, for example, has had severe depression for about 4 years, and that 4 years dated from the time that this man was wrestling with coming to grips with the fact that he was gay. Now, he went into a psychiatrist 4 years earlier, and the psychiatrist went down a list of symptoms. He had all the symptoms of depression, said, you've got neurotransmitter problems, chemical imbalance, here, take some meds. When you think about that, it's a horrendous way to treat somebody. Beyond that, if you think about someone, say, who has schizophrenia, even if there were no psychological components to schizophrenia, even if there was no contribution of the environment to it whatsoever, what you essentially have here is a person who has had the worst possible trauma, your mind going on you. You lose your ability to tell inside from outside, to tell real from unreal. If you could think of treating somebody like that without talking with them, it's absolutely a preposterous proposition. Yet that is, in fact, how most schizophrenics are treated in our country, which is they are given medications and not given any kind of talk, which you would think that those are people who would need regular talk therapy as well as the medications. The things that lead to this are there are a number of forces other than, and again, this speaks to some points about the sociology of science and the sociology of psychology that determine why people hold particular perspectives. You can make much more money as a practitioner if you give people drugs, because you can see every 10 minutes you can come in and check someone for their medication levels, and you can send them back out, and you can make a lot of $100,000s a year that way. Again, I'm not saying that every time a person gets medication for psychological disorders that's inappropriate or it's money grubbing by a psychiatrist. And I don't think even when it is money grubbing, it's probably not terribly conscious. The person is probably believing in this. But the idea that that someone can come in with a severe depression, for example, and even if that has no psychological causes whatsoever, the idea that you don't need to talk to them for an hour once a week just seems, on the face of it, seems awfully peculiar. There are a number of other factors like that influence how psychiatric treatment or psychological treatment occurs. I mean, the fact that drug companies pour millions of dollars every year into studies of the efficacy of their drugs, and that in turn leads to more publications by biological researchers, that in turn shifts the field in a biological direction. Those are the kind of things that do in fact have an influence. I'd like to conclude by saying something about some of the thorny mind-body issues here, or I guess you might say body-soul issues here, about what is sickness, for example, and what is sin. I mean, if indeed you can talk about a person as having a diseased brain, and you can say, let's take a less extreme case. I'll give you one. It's extreme in a different way, but the person is not psychotic. This was a man who came into my office who he actually had another agenda. He was not there out of his own free will entirely, but he was a man who was a sociopath, who has minimal sense of conscience, minimal sense of right and wrong, very, very manipulative guy, and in fact had some manipulative intentions with me as well at that time in coming in. So here's a guy, he was in some trouble with the law, and his lawyer said if you go see a shrink, they'll go off more easy on you. I mean, that was why he was there. He was not, I guess he was there probably for a number of reasons. He also did want some help, sort of, but this was not the kind of guy who was going to come to a mental health professional and say, Doc, listen, I got no conscience, will you help me? Now, this guy described an incident at length in which he had essentially tortured a close relative of his by brandishing a knife over this young man for about an hour, making all kinds of horrible threats that none of them he carried out, but they were pretty real threats. I mean, if this man were sitting over you with a knife at your throat, you would be terrified. Now, so he's describing this to me, and I might add that there were he wanted me to sign a statement saying that he had come to the therapy and that I was going to see him in therapy and that kind of thing. And here he is telling me about how he deals with people who don't do things that he wants. And that is indeed something you pick up on clinically, is are there messages that the person is sending you other than the ones that they are intending or that they're telling you they're intending. In any case, now you could say, okay, this man he is not psychotic. He's clearly able to tell what he's doing. He knew what he was doing. He was getting a real kick out of scaring this person. Okay, so he was fully in control of his faculties. Yet, here's the problem. This is a guy who had been severely abused as a child by his father. He had a family history of schizophrenia, and we do know that there is a higher incidence of sociopathy or of rates of being sociopaths among relatives of schizophrenics. That, again, I should say with all these things, that's not to say if you have a schizophrenic relative, therefore you're going to be schizophrenic or a sociopath. But in any case, there was a higher rate so biologically there may well have been a vulnerability in his family that could have contributed to his being a sociopath. We know he was beaten badly as a child, which could certainly contribute to his being a sociopath. Can we ultimately hold him accountable for who he is and for what he was doing? At that moment, I guess we can say, yeah, he had free will. He was making a choice about whether or not to hold that knife at that person's throat. But can we really say in some ultimate sense that this man is in control of who he is, that he has responsibility for who he is? Can we really hold any of us accountable for who we are and for what we do, given that we are all biological creatures who then are exposed to various kinds of environmental pressures as well? I wish I had an answer for that, but I don't. And in our next lecture, we'll begin talking about psychoanalytic approaches to personality and abnormal psychology.